In the final weeks of her life, Gabby Petito was smiling for the camera. Soft desert sunsets, carefully framed van life shots. A curated dream of freedom, love, and open highways. But behind that lens, something was collapsing, and almost no one saw it in time. Tonight, we are not just revisiting a tragedy, we are dissecting it, because the most disturbing part of Gabby's story is not how it ended, it's how predictable it may have been. In 2021, Gabby and her fiancé, Brian Laundrie, set out on a cross-country road trip across the American West. They weren't just traveling, they were documenting, building a brand, selling a lifestyle, creating a digital memory of young love on the open road. To the audience watching online, it looked romantic, but psychologically, it already showed fractures. When couples attempt high-intensity isolation, confined spaces, financial stress, performance pressure from social media, existing personality traits don't disappear. They amplify. A van is not just a vehicle, it becomes a pressure chamber, and pressure reveals character. On August 12th, in Moab, Utah, police bodycam footage captured something haunting in hindsight. Gabby was crying, apologizing, taking responsibility, trying desperately to calm the situation. Brian appeared composed, calm, controlled, and that contrast matters. In high-conflict relational dynamics, especially where emotional dependency exists, one partner often internalizes blame to preserve attachment. Gabby repeatedly described herself as mean, OCD, difficult. Brian described her as emotional. Notice the psychological imbalance. She self-criticized, he externalized. She cried, he smiled. To the untrained eye, it looked like a stressed young couple. To a behavioral analyst, it hinted at something darker. Control doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Isolation is one of the most powerful accelerants in volatile relationships. Friends and family later revealed tension, mood swings, arguments. But once they were deep into national parks, desert highways, remote campsites, there were no witnesses, no emotional escape routes. And when isolation combines with identity instability, control can become survival. Brian's psychological presentation suggested something subtle but dangerous, a need for dominance disguised as calm rationality. This type of personality often fears abandonment deeply, but instead of expressing fear, it exerts control over environment, over narrative, over the partner, and when that control feels threatened, the reaction can be catastrophic. By late August, something shifted. Gabby's communication with her family became irregular. Texts felt off, tonally different. Less warmth, less authenticity, then silence. Here is where the psychological tension sharpens. When someone disappears in a relational context, the partner's behavior becomes critical data. Brian returned home to Florida, alone. He did not report her missing. He did not publicly search. He did not speak. Instead, he lawyered up. Silence is not always guilt, but in psychological profiling, avoidance under high emotional stakes is rarely neutral. Most innocent partners behave chaotically. They panic, they over-explain, they plead publicly. Brian withdrew. And withdrawal can be a form of control. If you cannot control the relationship, you control the narrative vacuum. On September 19th, human remains were discovered in Wyoming's Bridger Teton National Forest, later confirmed to be Gabby. Cause of death: homicide by strangulation. Strangulation is intimate. It requires proximity, eye contact, time. It is not impulsive in the way a weapon discharge can be. It is personal. Psychologically, strangulation often reflects rage intertwined with possession. It is about silencing, about stopping resistance. about ultimate control. In cases involving coercive dynamics, strangulation frequently follows escalating patterns of emotional instability and perceived loss of dominance. And then, before answers could fully form, Brian disappeared. For weeks, the nation watched a manhunt unfold. Then, his remains were discovered in a Florida nature reserve, alongside a notebook. Authorities later announced that Brian had claimed responsibility, case closed, but psychologically, not finished. Because confessions written in isolation are narratives, and narratives are curated. We will never cross-examine him. We will never see courtroom testimony. We will never observe his behavioral micro-expressions under direct questioning. What we are left with is a tragic psychological equation. A young woman chasing independence. A young man struggling with control. Isolation, escalation, silence, and finally, violence. The most haunting part of Gabby's story isn't the crime scene. It's the warning signs that looked ordinary. Emotional imbalance dismissed as stress. Apologies mistaken for accountability. Control mistaken for calmness. In relationships shaped by coercive patterns, the danger often hides inside love narratives. Not monsters in dark alleys, but partners in shared photographs. Gabby's final months were documented publicly, and yet the psychological deterioration went largely unseen. Because control, when subtle, rarely looks like control. It looks like stability until it isn't. Here is the unbearable irony. The road trip was meant to document freedom. Instead, it documented confinement. The van symbolized adventure. It became isolation. The camera meant to capture love, captured the last images before disappearance. And while viewers double-tapped photos, a psychological storm was forming just outside the frame. Was it a single explosive argument? A slow burn pattern, reaching its inevitable peak? A moment of panic? Or a final act of dominance when control slipped beyond recovery? Without trial testimony, we are left reconstructing behavior from fragments. But patterns speak, and patterns in this case whisper something chilling. The tragedy may not have been spontaneous. It may have been building long before Wyoming, long before silence, long before the last photo. And if that is true, then the most disturbing part isn't that it happened, it's that it followed a psychological blueprint we have seen before, and will likely see again. Gabby Petito's story became a national headline, but beneath the headlines lies a lesson about coercive dynamics, emotional dependency, and the quiet evolution of control. In part 2, we examine the notebook, the timeline inconsistencies, and the psychological contradictions inside Brian's final written confession. Because what he claimed happened in those final hours may not align with behavioral reality, and if it doesn't, then the truth about what really happened to Gabby may be even more unsettling than we think. When they found him, it was quiet. A Florida nature reserve, waterlogged earth, dense trees swallowing sound. Weeks after the nation had already decided who he was, the remains of Brian Laundrie were discovered in Miakahatchee Creek Environmental Park. Near him, a backpack, a revolver, and a notebook. For many, that notebook was closure. For behavioral analysts, it was the beginning of new questions. Authorities later revealed that inside the notebook, Brian claimed responsibility for the death of Gabby Petito. But confessions written in isolation are not testimony. They are storytelling, and storytelling reveals psychology. According to officials, Brian described Gabby as injured. He implied mercy. He framed her death as an act of compassion, a tragic necessity, an accident wrapped in protection. But here's what makes that explanation psychologically unstable. When someone constructs a mercy narrative, they often minimize personal agency. They shift motive, they blur intent, and most importantly, they reassign identity. In his version, he wasn't the aggressor, he was the rescuer. That cognitive reframing matters, because it suggests something deeper than guilt. It suggests image control, even in death. Let's examine the timeline. Gabby's remains were found in Wyoming. Brian returned alone to Florida. He remained silent for days, then vanished. If his narrative were truly rooted in panic or mercy, why the structured withdrawal? Why lawyer up immediately? Why avoid press statements? Why not tell authorities the story of an accident? Behavior under stress reveals instinct, and instinct under perceived innocence is rarely strategic. Innocent individuals talk, they explain, they overshare. Brian did none of that. He controlled exposure. He conserved information. He withdrew into silence. Silence, in behavioral psychology, can function as a defensive barrier, but it can also function as dominance. You can't contradict a man who refuses to speak. Gabby's cause of death was homicide by strangulation. That detail is not emotionally neutral. Strangulation requires sustained pressure, sustained proximity. It is physically intimate. It is prolonged. It does not align cleanly with a spontaneous mercy act. Medical experts consistently note that strangulation takes time. Time to reconsider, time to stop, time to choose differently. And that creates a fracture between the physical evidence and the emotional framing in the notebook. When narrative and forensics conflict, psychology fills the gap. There is a phenomenon in criminology known as post-offense narrative management. It occurs when an offender attempts to re-author events to preserve ego identity. Brian's written explanation framed Gabby as fragile, hurt, in pain. He positioned himself as protector, but in prior police footage from Utah, we saw a different dynamic. Gabby apologized. She internalized blame. She feared abandonment. Brian appeared calm, detached, regulated. That behavioral pattern suggests dominance hierarchy. So why, in the notebook, would he shift into savior mode? Because savior narratives are socially digestible. They reduce outrage, they soften perception, and most importantly, they protect legacy, even if no one believes them. Brian's remains were found in an area that had previously been underwater. Officials stated flooding delayed discovery, but psychologically, the location choice raises questions. Nature reserve, isolation, familiar terrain, suicide by firearm. That final act fits a particular personality profile. Individuals who fear public humiliation sometimes prefer self-inflicted death over prolonged legal exposure. Trials are unpredictable. Cross-examination strips narrative control. A courtroom would have dissected inconsistencies. It would have introduced forensic contradiction. It would have amplified scrutiny. But a notebook offers final authorship. And final authorship can feel powerful. What we never received was interrogation footage. No behavioral breakdown under questioning. No visible stress response to direct accusation. No micro-expressions during confrontation. Instead, we were handed a written explanation and told the story was complete. But psychologically, unresolved narratives leave residue. Because something in that notebook reportedly stood out. The language lacked chaotic remorse. It lacked fragmented thought. It read structured, composed, curated, and composure after violent loss often signals dissociation or calculation. There is another layer rarely discussed publicly. Before Wyoming, before silence. There were small signs of escalating instability, witness reports of arguments, changes in tone during calls home, emotional imbalance, patterns that often precede coercive escalation. In many intimate partner homicides, escalation occurs after perceived loss of control. breakup threat, an exposure risk, a moment when dominance slips. What if Wyoming was not about injury? What if it was about departure? What if Gabby had reached a psychological threshold and Brian sensed it? Loss of control for some personalities feels existential, and existential fear can trigger irreversible action. Here's what unsettles investigators to this day. The notebook describes motive, but not sequence. It explains intent, but not escalation. It frames mercy, but not argument. And crucially, it omits emotional volatility. No mention of rage, no description of panic, no acknowledgement of dominance conflict. Almost as if the emotional core was intentionally removed. Why sanitize the chaos? Unless chaos reveals truth. There is something deeply unsettling about a man who documents his final explanation. Because explanations are designed, and design implies awareness. But what if the notebook was never meant to explain the crime? What if it was meant to control how history remembers it? And if that's true, then we have to ask a more disturbing question. Was the violence in Wyoming the breaking point? Or was it the final stage of a psychological pattern that had been forming long before the road trip began? In part 3, we examine the early relationship dynamics, the subtle red flags before van life, the dependency patterns, the emotional hierarchies, and the overlooked moment long before Utah that may reveal this tragedy was not sudden, but inevitable, because sometimes the most important clues don't appear at the crime scene, they appear at the beginning. Every case reveals a hidden mind. Subscribe so you never miss the next investigation.